Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight we drift into the shadows of the Bear Brook murders. Imagine, if you will, the month of November in the year 1985. The air in New Hampshire has turned sharp and brittle, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying maple leaves, and the first hints of a coming winter frost. It is a time of transition, where the vibrant oranges and reds of autumn have faded into a landscape of gray branches and dark, reaching evergreens. The sun sits low in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the forest floor, and the wind whispers through the pines with a low, mournful sigh. In the small town of Allenstown, life moves at a gentle, rhythmic pace, undisturbed by the frantic hum of the distant cities. People here know the names of their neighbors, and the woods are seen as a place of solace, a vast backyard where the only sounds are the occasional call of a crow or the rhythmic drumming of a woodpecker against a hollow trunk. But deep within the heart of the wilderness, a secret has been resting in the silence, waiting for the light of day to find it. Bear Brook State Park is a sprawling expanse of over 10,000 acres, a kingdom of granite and pine that feels ancient and indifferent to the passage of time. On the 10th of November, 1985, a hunter moved through the underbrush, his boots crunching softly over the frozen leaves and dry twigs. He was deep within the park, near the site where a small store and a trailer had once stood before being claimed by fire. The ground here was uneven, carpeted with pine needles that dampened the sound of his footsteps. The air was so still that he could hear the sound of his own steady breathing, a rhythmic puff of white vapor vanishing into the chill. As he pushed through a thicket of brush, his eyes caught something that didn't belong to the natural order of the forest. It was an object made of metal, industrial and cold, contrasting sharply against the organic textures of the bark and the soil. It was a 55-gallon steel drum, resting on its side among the weeds and the forgotten debris of human presence. The drum was a bruised, dark blue color, though time and the elements had not been kind to it. Patches of orange rust bloomed across its surface like a slow-moving infection, flaking away to reveal the raw, gray metal beneath. It sat there, heavy and silent, partially obscured by the shifting shadows of the trees. When the hunter approached, the very air seemed to thicken with a sense of unease. This was not merely a piece of discarded litter. It was a heavy vessel, sealed and discarded in a place where it was never meant to be found. The lid was slightly ajar, or perhaps the metal had buckled, allowing the secrets held within to finally breathe. As he looked closer, the hunter saw the edges of heavy plastic bags, the kind used for refuse, tucked tightly inside the cylinder. There was no immediate smell, only the scent of old metal and the dampness of the earth, but the sight of those plastic bundles sent a sudden, icy shiver down his spine. It was a stillness that felt heavy, a silence that carried the weight of a story untold for years. With a trembling hand, the discovery was made certain. Inside that rusted blue drum lay the remains of two human beings. They were not fresh. They were skeletonized, reduced by time to the essence of what they once were, yet still holding the shape of their shared tragedy. There was an adult woman, her age later estimated to be between 23 and 33 years old, and beside her, a young girl, perhaps only 9 or 10 years of age. They were wrapped in that thick plastic, hidden away in the dark for months, or perhaps even years, before the hunter's path crossed theirs. The brutality of their end was written in the bone, with evidence of blunt force trauma to their heads, a violent conclusion to lives that had somehow slipped through the cracks of the world. No one in Allenstown knew who they were. No one had reported them missing. They were ghosts found in the brambles, two souls who had been discarded like refuse in the middle of a beautiful, indifferent forest. The impact on the community was immediate and profound. Allenstown was a place where doors were left unlocked and children played freely until the street lamps flickered to life. Now, a darkness had been unearthed that couldn't be ignored. The local police and state investigators descended upon the park, their blue and red lights flashing against the dark trunks of the trees, casting long, rhythmic shadows that danced through the night. The news moved through the town like a cold draft under a door. People spoke in hushed tones at the local markets, their eyes drifting toward the woods that bordered their homes. Who were they? Where did they come from? The questions hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. The woman and the child were eventually laid to rest in a local cemetery, their names replaced by a simple, heartbreaking inscription on a donated stone. Known only to God. They became the Bear Brook Jane does, a mystery that would haunt the state for the next 40 years. A quiet ache in the heart of the woods that refused to be forgotten as the first snow of 1985 began to fall, covering the forest in a white, silent shroud. For 15 long years, the forest of Bear Brook State Park held its breath. The seasons cycled through their predictable rhythms, each one layering more distance between the present and the grim discovery of 1985. Autumns brought a heavy carpet of oak and maple leaves, burnished gold and deep crimson, which fell to the forest floor to rot into a thick, damp mulch. Winters encased the towering pines in blankets of heavy, silent snow, muffling the world and hiding the scars left by the investigators' boots. Each spring, the thaw would arrive with the smell of wet earth and the insistent buzzing of insects, as new ferns uncurled their delicate heads from the soil. The town of Allenstown moved forward, the sharp edge of the initial shock dulling into a dull ache of unanswered questions. The blue barrel found by the hunter had become a ghost story, a dark piece of local lore that parents used to warn their children against wandering too far into the thickets. But the woods were not empty. Beneath the canopy of hemlock and birch, only a short walk from where the first victims had been found, another secret lay submerged in the shadows, waiting for the light to return. It was May 9th, in the year 2000. The air in the park was thick with the humidity of late spring, carrying the scent of pine resin and the sweet, heavy perfume of blooming wildflowers. A New Hampshire state trooper moved through the undergrowth, his boots crunching softly over the brittle remains of last year's branches. The department had decided to revisit the site, driven by a nagging sense that the earth still had more to say. There was no fanfare, no grand expectation of a breakthrough, just the quiet, methodical work of men who refused to let a cold trail disappear entirely. The trooper pushed aside a heavy curtain of low-hanging pine boughs, the needles scratching against his uniform with a dry, rhythmic sound. He was standing approximately 100 yards from the original site, where the first drum had been unearthed. The terrain here was uneven, a graveyard of fallen logs and moss-covered stones that made every step a deliberate act. The sunlight filtered through the dense ceiling of leaves in erratic patches, creating a mosaic of brightness and deep, velvet shadows on the ground. Suddenly, something caught the trooper's eye, a glint of something that did not belong to the organic palette of the forest. It was a patch of dark, weathered blue, partially obscured by a drift of dead leaves and the twisted roots of a nearby birch tree. He knelt down, the dampness of the soil seeping through the fabric of his trousers. As he brushed away the debris with a gloved hand, the unmistakable shape of a 55-gallon industrial steel drum began to emerge. It was identical in make and color to the one found 15 years earlier, yet it looked older, more surrendered to the elements. The metal was pitted with rust, the orange-brown oxidation blooming across the blue surface like a slow-motion fire. A heavy, hollow silence seemed to fall over the woods in that moment. The birdsong grew distant, and the wind died down, leaving only the sound of the trooper's own shallow breathing. He reached out to touch the cold, unyielding surface, a sense of profound dread beginning to coil in his chest. This was not a new crime. This was a shadow that had been cast decades ago, a twin to the horror they thought they had already catalogued. The trooper stood and returned to his vehicle to retrieve a flashlight, his mind racing with the implications of what he had found. When he returned to the barrel, the beam of light sliced through the dimness under the trees, illuminating the interior of the tipped-over drum. He peeled back a layer of heavy, translucent plastic that had been used to wrap the contents. At first, his eyes struggled to make sense of what the light revealed, a pale, smooth curve that stood out against the dark interior. It was a bone. As he shifted the light, the reality of the situation became agonizingly clear. Inside the drum lay the skeletal remains of two more human beings. They were small, heartbreakingly small. Forensic investigators would later determine that these were two young girls, much younger than the child found in the first barrel. One was estimated to be between 2 and 4 years old, her tiny frame suggesting a life that had barely begun. The second was even smaller, an infant or toddler between the ages of 1 and 3. They had been placed together in this cold, metal tomb, hidden just out of sight, while the rest of the world went on for 15 years. The discovery sent a fresh wave of cold electricity through the New Hampshire State Police. The realization was devastating. Back in 1985, while the world watched the recovery of the first 2 victims, these 2 children had been lying only a few hundred feet away, unnoticed. The original search had been comprehensive for its time, but the dense New Hampshire wilderness is a master of concealment. The second drum had been tucked away in a slight depression in the land, shielded by a fallen tree that had since rotted away, finally revealing the rusted metal to the eyes of the law. Now the scope of the crime had doubled. This was no longer just a tragic double homicide. It was the work of someone who dealt in absolute erasure. The investigators looked at the 2 barrels, side by side in their minds, and saw a pattern of methodical cruelty. These children had died of blunt force trauma. Their lives ended with the same brutal efficiency as the woman and the older girl. As the sun began to set on that May evening, casting long, skeletal shadows across the park, the investigators knew that the dormant case had not just been reignited. It had been transformed into a hunt for a ghost who had left 4 lives in the soil. The years following 1985 did not bring answers. They only brought a thick, suffocating layer of dust over the case files. In the evidence lockers of the New Hampshire State Police, the silence was heavy. Outside, the world moved on. The seasons in the park turned with a rhythmic, indifferent cruelty. Every autumn, the pine needles fell in a copper carpet, covering the spot where the first blue barrel had been found. Every winter, the frost bit deep into the granite soil, and every spring, the snow melt would trickle into the earth. Yet the identity of the woman and the young girl remained as frozen as the ground itself. They were buried in a small plot in a Lenstown, their headstone bearing a message that they were known only to God. For 15 long years, the investigation was a series of closed doors and fading leads. Detectives would occasionally pull the files, their fingers tracing the grainy black and white photographs of the crime scene, searching for some detail that had been missed in the original whirlwind of the discovery. They looked at the dental work, which was significant and suggested a life of some care, yet no dentist came forward with a name. The woman and child were ghosts in the machinery of the law, wandering the periphery of a world that had seemingly forgotten they ever existed. The arrival of the year 2000 brought a sudden, chilling thaw to the cold case. It was a day in May, a time when the woods should have been waking up with the scent of damp moss and new growth. Instead, a second barrel was discovered, barely 100 feet from the site of the first. It was a moment of profound, sickening realization for the investigators. For 15 years, they had walked past this spot. For 15 years, 2 more children had been waiting in the shadows of the pines, encased in the same industrial steel that had held their mother and sister. This new discovery did not just double the body count. It deepened the mystery into something far more sinister. The forensic team moved with a practiced, somber delicacy. The air in the woods was still, the only sound the soft scrape of shovels and the hushed murmurs of the men in white suits. Inside this second barrel were the remains of 2 more young girls, their small frames tangled together in a final, tragic embrace. Now there were 4. 4 souls without names, found in the same stretch of woods, separated only by time and a few yards of forest floor. The realization was heavy. They were looking for a family that had vanished without a single ripple in the pond of society. As the investigation entered the new millennium, science began to offer tools that the detectives of the 1980s could only have dreamed of. They turned to the world of isotopes, a branch of forensic chemistry that reads the very atoms of the human body like a diary. Every person carries within their teeth and bones a chemical signature of the water they drank and the food they ate during their life. By drilling into the enamel of the victim's teeth, scientists were able to map out a ghostly itinerary of their movements. The analysis revealed a complex story. The adult woman and the oldest and youngest girls shared a common history written in their marrow. They had spent time in the Northeast, likely in New Hampshire or neighboring states, in the months before their deaths. But their earlier years pointed elsewhere, perhaps to the West or the Midwest. The chemical signatures suggested they were travelers, moving through the vast landscape of America before they finally came to rest in the quiet woods of Allenstown. This data provided a map, but no destination. It told the investigators where they had been, but it could not tell them who they were. The atoms spoke of oxygen and lead, of soil and rain, but they remained stubbornly silent about the names that belonged to those faces. While the chemists worked in their sterile labs, forensic artists were busy trying to give the victims back their humanity through the stroke of a pencil. At the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, artists sat with the skulls of the 4 victims, meticulously rebuilding their features with clay and charcoal. It is a haunting process, a slow resurrection of the dead. The artist's hand moves with a strange intimacy, tracing the curve of a jawline, the width of a brow, and the unique gap between a child's front teeth. They created sketches that were intended to trigger a memory in a long-lost relative or a forgotten neighbor. These images were released to the public in 2013 and again in 2015. The faces were soft, innocent, and deeply unsettling. The woman had a gentle, wavy hair and a gaze that seemed to ask for peace. The children looked like any other kids you might see on a playground, with pigtails and shy smiles. Yet, despite the images being broadcast across the country, no one called. No one recognized the curve of the woman's nose or the bright eyes of the toddlers. It was as if a giant eraser had been taken to their lives, leaving only these charcoal ghosts to stare back at a world that didn't know them. Among the 4, there was one child who stood apart, a mystery within a mystery. Forensic testing revealed a jarring truth. The middle child, a girl between the ages of 2 and 4, was not biologically related to the woman or the other 2 girls. This revelation sent a shockwave through the investigation. If the woman was the mother of the oldest and youngest, who was this middle girl? She had been found in the same barrel as the youngest child, treated with the same horrific disregard, yet she was an outsider to the family unit. Her isotopic signature was different, too. It suggested she might have spent her early years in the upper Midwest, or perhaps as far south as Texas. She was a different puzzle entirely, a child who had been pulled into the orbit of a predator and discarded alongside a family that wasn't hers. Investigators began to refer to her simply as the middle child. She became a symbol of the utter isolation of the victims. How could a child be born, live for several years, and then vanish so completely that even her genetic origin remained a point of debate? The silence of the pines seemed to grow even deeper as they contemplated the possibility that they weren't just looking for one missing family, but a web of victims spanning thousands of miles. The decades continued to roll by, and the case of the Bear Brook 4 became a legend in the world of cold cases. It was a testament to the endurance of evil and the limitations of traditional police work. Every few years, a new detective would take the lead, bringing fresh eyes to the yellowed pages of the file. They would walk the perimeter of the park, feeling the crunch of dry leaves under their boots, trying to imagine the man who could carry 55-gallon drums into the thicket without being seen. They thought about the terror of those final moments in the woods, the smell of the pine, and the cold dampness of the New Hampshire air. The community of Allenstown never forgot. They held vigils and left flowers at the small grave in the cemetery. They adopted these nameless people as their own, a family of the forest that belonged to everyone and no one. The investigation was no longer just about catching a killer. It was about the restoration of identity. It was about the belief that no one should leave this world without a name. As the technology of DNA began to evolve into the realm of genetic genealogy, a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon. The silence was still there, but it was beginning to vibrate with the possibility of a voice. The names were out there, hidden in the strands of hair and the microscopic dust of the past, waiting for the right moment to finally be spoken aloud. The brick walls of the Wambeck Mill in Manchester, New Hampshire, were steeped in the scent of aged iron and the persistent, ozone-tinged tang of electrical current. In the late 1970s, the machinery there hummed with a rhythmic, hypnotic vibration that seemed to mask the secrets of those who walked its hollowed hallways. Among the workers was a man who moved like a shadow through the corridors, a skilled electrician who went by the name of Bob Evans. He was a man of few words, his presence as unremarkable as the gray New England mist, yet there was a coldness in his eyes that few dared to question. He worked with a meticulous, silent precision, his fingers tracing the copper veins of the building with an ease that suggested a lifetime of hiding in plain sight. At the time, the people of Manchester saw only a drifter with a knack for repair, a man who had seemingly appeared from the ether to settle in their midst. They could not have known that the quiet man in the grease-stained jumpsuit was a master of reinvention, a human chameleon who had already left a trail of fractured lives across the wide expanse of the country. The shadows of the mill felt heavy, pregnant with the weight of things left unsaid. As the man known as Bob moved through his days, waiting for the moment when the air would turn cold and the urge to vanish would strike again. By the time 1981 arrived, Bob Evans had woven himself into the life of a young woman named Denise Bowden. She was 23 years old, with a bright smile and a 6-month-old daughter named Dawn. To her family, the man Denise brought home for Thanksgiving dinner was just another chapter in her life, a partner who promised stability even as the winds of winter began to howl through the valley. The meal was shared in the warmth of a kitchen filled with the aroma of roasted turkey and the soft, gurgling sounds of a baby in her crib. But as the holiday ornaments were packed away and the first heavy snows began to blanket the Hayward Street apartment, a chilling silence descended. On a night when the frost cracked the very earth, Bob Evans, Denise, and little Dawn disappeared. There were no notes left on the counter, no frantic calls to relatives, just an empty apartment where the heat had been turned low, and the echoes of a life once lived drifted like dust motes in the pale morning light. For years, Denise's family believed they had simply moved away to escape the crushing weight of financial debt. They did not know that the man they had trusted was leading Denise into a void from which she would never emerge. The trail they left was as thin as a single strand of copper wire, stretching out toward the setting sun, where the landscape turned from the jagged pines of the east to the sprawling, sun-baked highways of the west. In the golden, hazy light of California, the man once known as Bob Evans shed his skin as easily as a snake in the tall grass. By the mid-1980s, he had become Curtis Mayo Kimball, a name that tasted of salt and diesel. He worked the same trades, his hands always busy with the guts of machines, but the darkness followed him like a loyal dog. In 1985, A drunk driving accident in Cyprus brought the law to his door, yet he slipped through their fingers, re-emerging in the cool, redwood-shadowed air of Scott's Valley. Now calling himself Gordon Jensen, he lived in a trailer park where the scent of eucalyptus and wood smoke hung heavy in the evening air. With him was the girl, now 5 years old and called Lisa. The neighbors saw a father and daughter, a pair of nomads tethered together by the thin walls of an RV. But the bond was a lie, a cruel fabrication maintained by a man who saw people as nothing more than disposable parts. One afternoon in 1986, under a sky the color of a bruised plum, the man walked away. He left the little girl at the park, telling her he would be back, but his footsteps never returned. He left her with the kindness of strangers and the haunting realization that the man she called father was a ghost, a specter who had stolen her name and her history before vanishing into the shimmering heat of the highway. The cycle of predation did not end with the abandonment of a child. It merely shifted form. More than a decade passed, a period of silence where the man moved through the world like a whisper, his true identity buried under a mountain of aliases and false histories. In the final days of the 20th century, he surfaced again in Richmond, California, under the name Lawrence Vanner. He was older now, his face lined with the passage of time, but the core of him remained unchanged. He met a woman named Yoon Jun, a chemist whose life was defined by logic and the clear, bright world of science. She could not have seen the rot beneath his calm exterior. They shared a home, a space filled with the quiet comforts of a shared life, until June of 2002. Suddenly, Yoon was gone. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, a familiar weight in the man's long history. When investigators finally entered the house, they were met with a sight that defied the peaceful neighborhood outside. In the darkness of the basement, beneath layers of cat litter and the cold, damp earth, they found the remains of Yoon Jun. She had been killed by blunt force trauma, a signature of violence that mirrored the tragedies left behind in the woods of New Hampshire 20 years prior. The chameleon had finally been cornered, his mask slipping as the cold iron of handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. In the sterile, fluorescent light of a prison cell, the man who had been Bob, Curtis, Gordon, and Larry waited for the end. He died in December 2010, taking his true name to the grave, or so he believed. But the world he had left behind was changing. The science of the small, the invisible threads of DNA began to pull at the tapestry of his lies. In 2016, the girl he had abandoned, the one he had called Lisa, finally found the truth of her own blood. She was not his daughter. She was Dawn, the baby who had vanished from Manchester so many years ago. This revelation acted as a lightning strike, illuminating the path back to the 55-gallon barrels in Bear Brook State Park. Using the same genetic genealogy that had identified the victims, investigators finally pierced the veil of the killer's identity. He was Terry Petter Rasmussen, a man born in Colorado in 1943, who had spent decades erasing himself from the record. The middle child in the barrel, the one who shared no maternal link to the others, was his own flesh and blood. A daughter named Rhea, born in 1976 and lost to the world before she could even understand the monster who held her hand. The chameleon's trail ended here, in a collision of science and sorrow, proving that even the longest shadow eventually meets the light of the morning. The air in the laboratory is always a specific kind of still, a sterile hush that feels like it is waiting for something to speak. In the early months of 2017, that silence was broken by the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of processors working through millions of lines of code. For decades, the 4 souls found in the woods of Alenstown had been ghosts without names, and the man who likely put them there had died in a California prison cell, taking his true identity to a pauper's grave. But science was changing. A new tool was emerging from the intersection of biology and history, a process called genetic genealogy. It was not just about looking at a single strand of hair or a drop of blood. It was about tracing the very map of human connection. Investigators took the DNA from the man they knew only as Bob Evans, the man who had lived under a dozen different masks, and they handed it to a woman named Barbara Ray Venter. She was a retired attorney and a biologist, someone who understood that the secrets of the past are often hidden in the family trees of the living. She began to upload that genetic profile into public databases, searching for matches, distant cousins, third or fourth removed, people who shared tiny, shimmering segments of the same ancestors. It was like casting a net into a vast, dark ocean, hoping to pull up a single, guiding light through the digital mist. As Barbara worked, the screen of her computer became a forest of names and dates, a shimmering web of interconnected lives. She was not looking at the killer directly. She was looking at the people he had left behind, perhaps generations ago. The digital threads began to pull tight, narrowing down the possibilities from thousands to hundreds, and then to a single family line that stretched back through the decades. In the summer of 2017, the chameleon finally lost his camouflage. The man who had been Gordon Jensen, Curtis Kimball, and Larry Vanner was finally given his birth name, Terry Petter Rasmussen. He was born in Denver, Colorado in 1943. He had once been a husband, a father, and a serviceman. He had a history that could be traced on paper, school records, military discharge papers, a marriage license yellowed with age. The revelation was a cold shock to the system of the investigation. For the first time, the monster had a face and a history that did not start in a trailer park in 1985. But as the name Rasmussen was etched into the case files, it brought with it a haunting realization. DNA had already confirmed that this man was the biological father of the middle child found in the second barrel. If he was the father, then the crime was not just a serial killer disposing of strangers. It was a father discarding his own flesh and blood, a reality that hung heavy in the air of the New Hampshire State Police headquarters like a thick, unbreakable fog. With the killer identified, the focus shifted to the women who had crossed his path in the late 1970s. The investigation moved like a slow-motion ghost hunt through old archives and digital message boards, the investigators feeling the weight of the years with every turn of a page. In 2019, a librarian from Connecticut, who had been listening to the story of the case, noticed something on an ancestry website. It was a post from years earlier, a woman looking for her sister, Marlies Honeychurch, who had vanished around Thanksgiving in 1978. Marlies had last been seen in California, leaving her family's home after a heated argument. She had not left alone. She had her 2 young daughters with her, Marie and Sarah. The man she was dating at the time was a man named Terry. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered across 40 years and 3,000 miles, began to click into place with a sickening clarity. Investigators reached out to the family, performing the delicate, heartbreaking task of collecting DNA samples from the surviving relatives. The results were undeniable. The adult woman found in the first barrel in 1985 was indeed 24-year-old Marlies Elizabeth Honeychurch. The oldest child, found beside her, was 6-year-old Marie Elizabeth Vaughn. And the tiny girl found in the second barrel in the year 2000 was baby Sarah Lynn McWaters, who was only 11 months old when the world went dark for her in the cold shadows of the park. While the identification of Marlies and her daughters brought a heavy, somber peace to their family, one mystery remained like a jagged stone in the heart of the case. The middle child, the girl who was approximately 3 years old when she died, was not Marlies's daughter. She was Terry Rasmussen's daughter, but her mother was a different woman entirely. Who was she? Where had she come from? For several years, she remained known only as the middle child, a small, lonely figure in the narrative who had no name to reclaim. Genetic genealogists continued their tireless work, building a family tree that eventually spanned 25,000 names. They traced her maternal line back to ancestors who lived in the 1780s, searching for a woman who had crossed paths with a predator in the mid-70s. The science was painstaking. It required looking at the shape of a jaw, the specific overbite mentioned in her autopsy, and the traces of minerals in her bones that suggested she might have spent time in the South. The air in the research offices was thick with the scent of ozone and old paper as they worked, the weight of this unnamed child pressing against them. She was a little girl who had been born into a nightmare and left in the New Hampshire woods, and they refused to let her remain a ghost. The final breakthrough did not come until very recently, in the autumn of 2025. The DNA Doe Project, working alongside state investigators, finally found the missing link. They identified a woman named Pepper Reed, who had disappeared from California in the late 1970s. By searching through Orange County birth records from 1976, they found a certificate that had been buried in the archives for nearly half a century, the paper brittle and smelling of dust. It listed a baby girl named Rhea Rasmussen. The father was Terry Petter Rasmussen. The mother was Pepper Reed. Just months ago, in September of 2025, the world finally learned her name. Rhea. She was a little girl with wavy brown hair who was likely between 2 and 4 years old when her life was stolen. The middle child was no longer a ghost. She was Rhea, a daughter whose mother is also believed to have fallen victim to the man who was supposed to protect them. The identification of Rhea Rasmussen closed the final, agonizing chapter of the Allenstown Four, proving that even after 50 years, the truth can be pulled from the earth. On a cool afternoon in November of 2019, before the final name was known, a funeral was held at St. John the Baptist Cemetery in Allenstown. The community that had guarded these unknown victims for decades gathered under a gray, heavy sky. The scent of damp earth and lay-totem pine needles hung in the air, mixing with the soft sound of the wind through the bare branches. 2 new headstones were placed, no longer bearing the words known only to God, but instead the names Marlies and Marie. Later, Sarah would be laid to rest near her father's family, and now, preparations are being made for Rhea to join them in the light of recognition. The cold, rusted barrels are gone, replaced by the soft whisper of the wind through the trees and the quiet dignity of a name carved in stone. The science of DNA had done what decades of police work could not. It had reached back through time to pull these 4 souls out of the shadows, ensuring that they would never be forgotten again. The chameleon is dead, his many masks shattered by the very code of life he tried to extinguish. The forest is quiet now, the secrets of Bear Brook finally yielding to the light of a name. The air in Allenstown, New Hampshire, on that afternoon in November of 2019, was thick with a quiet, heavy humidity that seemed to cling to the tall, swaying pines bordering St. John the Baptist Cemetery. It was a day of soft shadows and muted colors, where the sky hung low like a gray wool blanket, shielding the earth from the harsh glare of the sun. At the edge of the cemetery, a small group had gathered, their footsteps muffled by the damp, dying grass and the carpet of fallen needles that crunched softly underfoot. They were there to witness something that many had feared would never happen in their lifetimes, the return of names to the nameless. For 34 years, the community had held a collective breath, a long and painful exhalation that had begun in 1985. The wind moved through the branches above, a low, melodic sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 3 decades of questions. On the edge of the hallowed ground stood a new headstone, its granite surface smooth and cold, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the somber faces of those who had worked tirelessly to reach this moment. It was a stark contrast to the old, weathered marker that had once stood there, which had spoken only of mortal remains known only to God. Now, the stone bore the weight of truth, etched deeply into the rock in elegant, permanent letters. The scent of fresh lilies and white roses drifted through the air, their fragrance sweet, and almost overwhelming against the sharp, metallic tang of the autumn breeze. The restoration of these names was not the result of a sudden confession or a lucky break, but a slow, meticulous weaving together of digital threads and microscopic strands of life. For years, the woman and the 3 children had been shadows in the archives, their faces reconstructed in clay and pixels, staring back at the world with sightless eyes. But then, the science of genetic genealogy began to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Far away from the woods of Bear Brook, in quiet rooms filled with the hum of computer fans and the soft clicking of keys, researchers like Barbara Ray Venter and dedicated individuals like Rebecca Heath began to untangle a family tree that had been deliberately pruned by a monster. They looked for cousins, for distant matches in vast databases, searching for a single spark that would light the way home. It was a librarian's curiosity and a genealogist's precision that finally found the connection. They found a post on an ancestry website from 1999, a digital message in a bottle cast out by a half-brother searching for a sister he had never known. The name Sarah Lynn McWaters began to vibrate through the wires, and with Sarah came the others. The woman was identified as Marlies Elizabeth Honeychurch, a mother who was only 24 years old when she vanished into the dark. Her oldest daughter, Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, was only 7. The youngest, Sarah, was a mere 11 months old. To say their names aloud for the first time in a court of law was like breaking a spell of silence that had lasted for more than 40 years. The names felt heavy in the mouth, solid and real, reclaiming a humanity that had been stolen and discarded in a rusted drum. At the funeral service, the silence was profound. It was a silence not of absence, but of presence. Marlies was no longer just a set of statistics. She was a woman who had loved her daughters, who had once had a life in California, who had introduced a man to her family on a long-ago Thanksgiving in 1978 before disappearing into the fog of 1,000 aliases. The attendees felt the presence of her memory in the way the light caught the edge of the flower petals. But even as Marlies, Marie, and Sarah were welcomed back into the light of history, a flicker of shadow remained. One child was missing from the names on that day in 2019. The middle child, the little girl with the chestnut hair who had been found alongside them. For years, she remained the final mystery, the one whose DNA told a different, darker story. She was the biological daughter of the killer, Terry Petter Rasmussen, a man whose true identity was as shifting as smoke. She was a child of the shadow, a little girl who had lived and died in a world of secrets, her mother a mystery that the earth seemed determined to keep. But the search did not stop at the cemetery gates. The researchers continued to dig through the genetic soil, looking for the mother of this lone child. And finally, in the year 2025, the last veil was lifted. Her name was revealed to be Rhea Rasmussen. Her mother was Pepper Reed, a woman who had also vanished, leaving behind only a trace of genetic legacy. The naming of Rhea was the final closing of a door that had stood ajar for nearly half a century. It meant that every soul found in those woods now had a place to rest, a story to be told, and a family to remember them. As the sun began to dip below the horizon of the New Hampshire hills, casting long, amber fingers across the graves, the sense of finality was palpable. The woods of Bear Brook State Park still stand, the trees still whisper in the wind, but the darkness that once lived there has been thinned by the light of the truth. The barrels are gone, replaced by the memory of justice and the persistent strength of human empathy. We think of Marlies, Marie, Sarah, and Rhea not as victims, but as daughters, sisters, and children who were finally found. Their journey from the tall grass and the rusted metal to the polished stone of the cemetery is a testament to the fact that no one is ever truly forgotten as long as someone is still looking. The mystery of the chameleon killer, the man of many names who thought he could erase the very existence of those he touched, has been dismantled piece by piece. His legacy is a prison cell and a grave of his own, while theirs is a return to the light. The grass will grow over the new markers, and the seasons will change from the white of winter to the green of spring, but the names will remain. They are etched in stone, and they are etched in the hearts of those who listened to their silent plea for 40 years. The air is still now. The pine needles have stopped their dancing. The world is quiet and the names are home. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.